So there's a story about this little boy named Steven. He's about 8 years old, and his family decided to go on a camping trip one day. And while they were on this camping trip, Steven decided just to just walk around a little bit. He's near the camp, so he's not necessarily out of eyesight of his parents, but he just wanted to explore as a traditional 8-year-old boy would want to do. And he came across a very unique animal. He came across a squirrel. But the thing is, he thought this squirrel was so cool because it's not like any other squirrel he's ever saw before. Because well, normally squirrels are like brown and tan, but this squirrel is black and white. So he thought, wow, this is amazing. So he crept closer to this squirrel and he even wanted to hold it. But then all of a sudden, this squirrel sprayed this yucky stuff all over him, and he just smelled terrible, and he just started he ran to his mom and to his dad, saying that this squirrel sprayed him with this yucky stuff, and his parents looked at him. A squirrel sprayed this on you? Yeah, this that black and white squirrel. The parents said, Stephen, that's a skunk. They're not squirrels. And so Stephen felt embarrassed. And well, yeah, that wasn't exactly the greatest camping trip their family had. And Stephen even vowed that he would never do that again. He would never go near another squirrel. Now, 10 years later, Stephen is now 18 years old. His family decided to go on another camping trip, and they've been on a few others before with no other issues. But on this particular camping trip, he saw another black and white squirrel. Now, he knew that it was a skunk this time, and he knew that it was dangerous to go near this particular animal, but he said, "You know what? I went about grabbing him all wrong. If I had a different strategy, I might be able to pick him up, and I can avoid getting sprayed." So he decided to go up to the squirrel once again with this strategy, but sure enough, he got sprayed once again with this smelly, icky stuff that just all over him. Again, crying to his mom and dad that the skunk sprayed him. And they just looked at him and said, "You knew it was a skunk, and yet you decided to go near it. But I thought I had a better strategy this time." They just looked at him and be like, "Steven, don't go near the squirrel. Don't go near the skunk." So he said, "Okay, I won't do it again." 20 years later, Steven is all grown up and he got married and had a few kids of his own and wanted to take them on a camping trip. And well, he saw another skunk and he did research on how to properly capture a squirrel and not get sprayed, even specialty clothes to make sure to protect himself. So he decided to go to the squirrel and capture it, but guess what happened? He got sprayed again. And he still did not learn his lesson. Don't go near skunks. See, Stephen never learned his mistakes from the past. Now, for us, we don't necessarily have to go through a particular event to learn a particular lesson. For Stephen, he had to learn multiple times to never go near a skunk to not get sprayed. Now, for us, we don't necessarily have to be near a skunk to know don't go near a skunk. Or sometimes we know the lesson to not rob a bank, and we don't have to experience robbing a bank to not rob a bank. See, today we're actually going to be looking at a particular person who never learned his lessons from the past of his own mistakes or even past people's mistakes. We're continuing our series in Daniel. We're making another big jump in terms of timeline here. So again, with these first 6 chapters, it's not a timeline where it happens like events like right after another. There's several years that happened in between all these chapters. And so during the chapter, and so it's starting in chapter 1 in Daniel, we started in 605 BC, and now we're in 539 BC. So we have a massive jump in just these few 5 chapters. And this is about roughly 23-ish years from chapter 4. So that's a little distinction of that big jump from when King Nebuchadnezzar, when he got the mind of a beast in chapter 4, it's about another 20 plus years into chapter 5. Now, let's take a look here in this section. We're starting in verse 1 in chapter 5. It says, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, really quick, before I continue on with that, just a little bit of a background here. So King Belshazzar, who is this guy? Most likely he's the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. So King Nebuchadnezzar, he is now dead. He died around 562 BC. And so again, we're now in 539 BC. Most likely there was probably some other kings during that time frame, but during this time we're just focusing on King Belshazzar. So again, the grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. Now we are given the the characteristic of Belshazzar that his father is King Nebuchadnezzar, and we see that in verse 2. But the word father, particularly in Aramaic, which that was the language used in this particular section of scripture. So with scripture, there's 3 languages that were used. It was Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And the Old Testament is predominantly Hebrew. There's a few parts that Aramaic, and this is one of those parts. So we get a few sections in Daniel where Aramaic is used. And in the Aramaic language, the word father could reference to grandfather as well. So it's not necessarily a father in terms of direct descent, but it's also some ancestry meaning to that as well. And in terms of bloodline, in terms of the descendants, most likely Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Now we see that this new king, Belshazzar, again, he's having this great banquet of 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Well, here's the thing, guys. This is not exactly this simple like dinner party that we might see. Like people are just having some wine. It's like, oh yeah, we're playing some party games, just having fun. It's not like a New Year's festival. That's not what's going on here. Most likely this was a massive orgy. That's the type of banquet this is, unfortunately. And so then, as we continue on with this, in verse 2, while Belshazzar was drinking his wine, so most likely very drunk, he gave orders to drink or to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and of bronze and iron, wood, and stone. So with this first point, with the king's banquet, that's our first point here today. with this king's banquet, we see that Belshazzar, he's very drunk. He's not thinking straight here. He's asked for these goblets of gold and silver, these drinking vessels to be brought in to be used for to be drinking their wine with this festival. Now, most likely these goblets of gold and silver, most likely when King Nebuchadnezzar, when he took over Jerusalem back in 605 BC, when he took all different articles of gold and silver from the temple and brought them to Babylon, most likely he placed them in like some type of like trophy room in a way, kind of like placing them in a spot where it's look at all the cities that I've conquered, and these are the spoils of war. These are the trophies of my victories. So most likely that's where they stayed. And also, we learned from with Nebuchadnezzar after getting the mind of an animal, the mind of a beast, he finally learned, don't mess with God because God is the one true God. The God of Daniel is the one true God. So he then said, "Okay, I'm going to worship God now." But Belshazzar, he didn't learn that. And so he wanted to take these articles that were only meant for the use of the temple in Jerusalem for himself and to praise all the different gods that the Babylonians worshipped. So that was this big banquet. That was our first point. But then our second point here is the king sees the writing on the wall. This is verses 5 through 9. So starting in verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale and was so frightened his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. Verse 7, the king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing on the wall and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around their necks, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Verse 8, then the king's wise men came in, and they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So we see these fingers, this hand appears to start writing on the wall. Now, this isn't one like a little bit teeny tiny writing, like in the corner or anything like that. It was most likely a very big hand. The hand of God is coming in. A big hand just starts writing these big letters on the wall. And then Belshazzar got scared. And as we saw earlier, he was drunk, but probably seeing this hand, seeing this writing just all of a sudden appear, maybe the adrenaline just like started flowing through him, and maybe that helped him get a little bit sober. And so he sees this writing. He knows that, wait a second, it's not just me who's seeing this. Everyone in this banquet hall, everyone a part of this banquet is seeing this. They see this hand writing on the wall. They see the writing that's on the wall. And we see that in verse 6 that he turned pale and was so frightened his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. In a way, do you ever see like those cartoons where it's like the particular character, he's so scared, it's like his knees are knocking together a little bit, and like he's like almost a little bit dramatic, type of like falling down and stuff. Guys, that's kind of like how Belshazzar is here, but it's not a cartoon. It's not this little dramatic feeling. He was scared. I mean, friends, I would be too if I see this ginormous hand just randomly appear and start writing on the wall. And he asked for all of his wise men to come in and say, like, please, it's like translate this. What does this mean? And whoever does it, you'll get all these awards, all these rewards for doing this. You'll be clothed in purple. Purple is the sign of royalty. You'll get a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made third highest ruler in the kingdom. So you get riches, power, and glory. You get all that people truly want. But what's kind of unique is that we see his grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, whenever he's faced with these unique circumstances, he calls for his wise men. And what happens? The wise men can't interpret the dream. And here we see the same thing. That in verse 8, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. Shocker. It didn't work before, and it doesn't work now. But that doesn't mean we won't get an interpretation, because starting in verse 10, we see our third point. The queen gives advice. So the queen, this is in verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. So just a little context here. So the queen here, most likely this was not the wife of Belshazzar, because we see earlier in the text that the wives of Belshazzar were already a part of this big banquet, this big orgy. And so most likely the queen is the queen mother. So this is the mom of Belshazzar, who then says, "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." Verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appoint him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man, Daniel, whom the king also called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve different problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. So the queen, again, this is the king's mother, so Belshazzar's mother is saying, hey, there's a guy who he's a great guy. He's really good at what he does. He can help you do this. He helped the king of the past. He helped Nebuchadnezzar do dreams. He can do visions. He has all this great insights. He can do what you want to do. So call on him. And so then Belshazzar says, okay. I'll call Daniel. I'll call him. And we see that in starting in verse 13, which this is our fourth point, where Daniel interprets the writing on the wall. So in verse 14, so Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to them, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah?" Verse 14, "I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." So Daniel is brought in, and he's given the same potential rewards that the other wise men got. He's saying, like, hey, I'll give you all these riches, get you all this fame. Like, you will be the third highest person in Babylon. But then in verse 17, Daniel gives a reply. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell it what it means." So Daniel's just saying, like, hey, I don't want all these fame. I don't want these riches. I don't need that. I don't want it. But I will do what you ask. I don't know about you, but that would be really hard for me because it's like, wait a second. I get to have riches. I get to have some really nice clothing, and I get a lot of power in this kingdom. That would be really tough for me personally to give up. Now, that's just me. I don't know about you, but Daniel just said, hey, I don't want this stuff. I don't need this stuff, but I'll do what the king has asked. And then starting in verse 18, he explains how, right, O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Verse 19, because of the high position he gave him. All the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to be put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. Verse 20. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. Verse 21. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them everyone he wishes. But you, his son, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from the temple brought to you, and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. So I'm just going to stop there right now. So we see that Belshazzar, he knew what Nebuchadnezzar went through. And it wasn't that he saw it like on Instagram or he saw it in the newspaper. He saw it firsthand. He saw it live with his own eyes. So most likely Belshazzar was probably probably younger at the time, but it was not like the age of like 2 or 3 years old where you don't remember. He saw it firsthand and he knew everything that happened. He was a witness of Nebuchadnezzar's downfall. He knew what Nebuchadnezzar did in his pride, how his heart was hardened, and how he was given the mind of an animal. But it wasn't until that he praised God, that he acknowledged that God is sovereign over all the kingdoms of men. That's when Nebuchadnezzar's mind was restored. Belshazzar knew that. But instead of choosing God and instead of following Nebuchadnezzar's footsteps in terms of changing his ways and following God, Belshazzar says, I'm good. Kind of like with Stephen and the skunk. He knew it was wrong. He knew that he would be in trouble. But he said, nope, I want to chase that skunk. Belshazzar knew what he was doing. Now you could make the argument, well, he was drunk. Like he was like he's not really thinking right. It's like he's a king. He should know better. And so then Daniel, he was explaining all of this, how he knew of what Nebuchadnezzar did, but he chose to not worship the Most High God. And so then back to the writing on the wall, he translated it and it said, Mene Mene Tekel Perzim. This is what these words mean. This is in verse 26. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Verse 27, Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. And Perze, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then verse 29, then Belshazzar commanded Daniel as Belshazzar commanded, Daniel was clothed in purple and gold chains and was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So now just a little bit of extra understanding of what this writing is meaning. Belshazzar's reign is done. God is saying, you're done. He's not saying, oh, it will be finished in a few years. I'm not going to tell you when, but it's going to end soon. God is saying, you're done. Your kingdom is done tonight. Your reign is no more. I've had it. You want to defile me? Fine, you're done. And you know what? This actually goes back to Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue. If we reflect back with Daniel chapter 2, there was all these different metals that were on this great statue. The head represented, it was Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. It was the head of gold, and then it was the chest and arms of silver. Friends, that's the transition. Nebuchadnezzar's dream is becoming reality. How awesome is that? See, that original dream probably happened 40, 50-ish years prior to this moment, but it's happening, friends. This transition, the Medo-Persian Empire is going to start in Babylon. And it wasn't going to happen like on the next day or two. It was happening that night. That very night. Because when God said, you're done, he's saying you done. No more. And we understand this more in verse 30, which is this is our last point where a new king takes over Babylon. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And Darius, the Mede, took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So the Medo-Persians, they came in secretly. See, there was a river that ran underneath the city, and we don't have this in scripture, but we learned this from history, where there was a river that ran underneath Babylon. Well, what the Medo-Persians did, they just decided to create some type of dam upriver. So then the river level just went down. And so then this army literally just walked into the city, virtually unnoticed. And I want you to think about this, friends. During this time, what was Belshazzar doing? He was having a party. To think, what would have happened if he just said, you know what? Let's maybe put a few guards up on the walls. Let's just see what happens. Let's get our armies ready for an attack just in case. Because if he just noticed the water levels going down, he could have prevented it. But instead, he said, let's have a drunken orgy instead. But yes, so when God says your reign is done, you're done. You can't argue with God. You can try, but I don't think it's going to work. And so, yes, in verse 31, we see Darius the Mede took over the kingdom. So, King Darius, we're actually going to see him later on in Daniel chapter 6. I won't go too far into that. I'll leave that a little bit of a fun cliffhanger for next week. But yes, we have a new king, a new man in charge of Babylon now. So, with all this going on, what can we take away from this? The first one is learn from past sins. Friends, you don't have to go through an event to not learn a lesson. Just like with Stephen, he decided to go and he wanted to grab this skunk. We don't have to go through that in order to learn don't grab a skunk. Belshazzar, he watched firsthand of what all happened with Nebuchadnezzar when he didn't worship the Most High God. But he chose to not listen to that lesson. So, friends, learn from your past sins. Now, friends, I'm not here to claim that I'm sinless, that I've never sinned before. Friends, I'm a sinner. We're all humans. All right. I'm human too. Just because I'm up here doesn't mean that I'm more important than anyone else. I'm a sinner. I've rebelled against God. And believe me, friends, I hate it. In fact, I hate sinning because I know in my head I'm doing what is wrong against God. And yet I still fall. And I'm still learning these lessons in life to not fall into sin. Friends, I want you to learn these same lessons too. Learn from your past mistakes, learn from your past sins. Do not commit them again. To grow in your relationship, your walk with God, to become more Christ like. But our second application point, so we only got two today, but our second application point is Judgment Day is coming, friends. Judgment Day is coming. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't know when it will be. For Belshazzar, he found out that Judgment Day was that moment. And he realized what he did was wrong, but it was too late. He knew what he did was wrong, but he decided to sin anyway. And God said, "You're done." Judgment Day is coming, friends. So, friends, just remember to learn from your past mistakes, learn from your past sins. Because who knows? Maybe when Judgment Day comes, are you going to be sinning? Are you going to be worshiping God? Let us close in prayer.